My father laughed at me in a Denver courtroom, and the sound carried all the way to the back wall. He had 5 attorneys sitting with him at the plaintiff's table, all of them in suits that cost more than my truck. He looked at the empty chair beside me, then at me, and he asked the room whether his daughter couldn't even afford a lawyer. I didn't answer him. I walked to the bench and set down one sheet of paper. 11 seconds later, his lead attorney stopped breathing through his mouth. He stood halfway up, pointed at the page with a finger that would not hold still, and said, out loud, in front of everyone, that the seal on that document was not what he'd been told it was. My father's knees folded. He caught himself on the edge of the table, and he whispered a name he had not said out loud in 32 years. Ruth. Before I take you back to the beginning of this, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever watched a person who thought they were untouchable finally get touched, hit like and subscribe. This is Tiger Revenge, and this one took me 11 days. My name is Tessa Marchetti. I'm 37, and I'm a forensic structural engineer, which means when a building falls down, somebody calls me to explain why. I've spent my whole career on my knees in rubble with a flashlight in my teeth, reading concrete like other people read faces. I built my firm in a rented office above a tire shop on South Broadway, 2 employees. A coffee maker I bought at a garage sale. Not $1 of it came from my father, Roy Hollis, 66 years old, chairman of Hollis Structural. You see, when you drive into Denver from the east. I kept my money and his money in separate universes on purpose. I thought that was enough. It wasn't. On a Tuesday in March, I was sitting in a vinyl chair on the 7th floor of Rocky Mountain Children's, watching my daughter sleep. 7. Nell is 7. She has a gap in her front teeth she's proud of and a stuffed elk named Bartholomew that has been washed so many times he's gone gray. In January, she got a bruise on her shin that didn't fade. In February, we learned the word aplastic. Her bone marrow had simply stopped making blood, the way an old furnace stops making heat, and nobody could tell us why. By March, we had something better than why. We had a match. A 10 out of 10 unrelated donor out of the National Registry. A stranger somewhere in this country who had swabbed his cheek at a college blood drive ago and forgotten about it. The transplant team had a date. Conditioning chemotherapy was scheduled to start the following Monday, 6 days out. After that, there is no turning back. You burn the marrow out before you put the new marrow in, and if the donation doesn't happen, your child has no immune system and nothing to replace it with. My husband, Danny Marchetti, 39, teaches shop at a high school in Aurora. He'd been sleeping on the fold-out cot for 11 nights. He had sawdust in the seams of his jacket that he could not get out no matter how many times he washed it. And Nell said it made him smell like home, so he stopped washing it. That Tuesday at 4:40 in the afternoon, a woman from Patient Financial Services came in with a tablet held against her chest like a shield. She was kind about it. She said our insurer had opened of the policy. She said the transplant center could not issue financial clearance without an active pre-authorization, and that the donor's collection slot, the stranger's cheek swab, the appointment he'd taken off work for, would be released back to the registry if clearance didn't come through by Friday. I asked her what review meant. She said she wasn't allowed to say more. I already knew. I'd known since my phone had buzzed twice that morning with alerts from the bank.
My business operating account.
Hold. My personal checking at the same bank. Hold. A blanket administrative freeze pending an ex-parte order out of Denver District Court, filed by counsel for Hollis Structural, claiming that Marchetti forensic from a family trust and was
With assets.
and was therefore a disputed asset. It was garbage. It would never survive a real hearing. But a real hearing was 3 weeks away, and Nell's marrow was on a 6-day clock, and my father knew exactly how long a hospital will wait for a family to sort itself out. The elevator dinged at 5:15. Roy came in wearing a charcoal overcoat, and the cologne he's worn since I was a child, which is the smell of every good memory I have and every bad one. Behind him was my brother-in-law, Grant Wexler, 39, Senior Claims Director at Sentinel Mutual Insurance. Grant is married to my sister, Bianca Hollis, 34. He has the calm of a man who has never once been told no by anybody who could force it. They did not look at Nell. That's the detail that stays with me. They came into a room with a sleeping 7-year-old in it, and neither one of them looked at the bed. Roy sat down in Danny's chair. He crossed his legs. He said he wanted to talk about Larkspur Crossing. Larkspur Crossing is a mixed-use development on the north side. 6 weeks earlier, at 4:12 in the morning, the second and third levels of its parking structure came down in a pancake collapse across 11 cars. A night custodian named Ernesto Salas, 58, was emptying trash on level 2. A nursing student named Priya Raman, 22, was walking to her car after a shift. Both of them died under about 900 tons of concrete. Hollis Structural was the engineer of record. Roy told me the insurer's answer for circling. He said what he needed was a peer review letter, an independent forensic opinion, establishing that the failure originated in a bad concrete mix supplied by a subcontractor. He said the subcontractor was a small outfit out of Pueblo, already bankrupt, nobody left to hurt. He said he needed it signed by a licensed forensic structural engineer with a clean reputation and no financial ties to Hollis. He said it needed to be signed by me. I asked him what he thought I would say to that. He said he thought I'd say yes, because Grant had already explained to him how policy reviews work. Grant leaned against the doorframe and told me, very pleasantly, that Sentinel had flagged a material misrepresentation on our family policy. Something about an employment classification on a form Danny had filled out in 2019. He said reviews like that can take 90 days, or they can be resolved in a single afternoon by a director with turning authority. He said he had signing authority. Roy stood up and buttoned his coat. My sick Doppin Dickens, he told me to sleep on it. He said the family would need my signature by Thursday, and that they'd be waiting. Then he told me something I think he'd been saving, because he said it at the door, half-turned, the way you deliver a line you've rehearsed. He said that a real engineer knows that every structure has a load path, and that mine ran straight through a 7-year-old girl. They left. The door sighed shut on its hydraulic arm. Nell's IV pump clicked and clicked and clicked. Danny came back from the cafeteria with 2 coffees and found me standing in the middle of the room with my hands open at my sides. I told him what they'd said. He set the coffees down very carefully, the way you set things down when you don't trust your hands, and he asked me what we were going to do. I told him I was going to go find out who actually owns Hollis Structural. Because here is what my father had forgotten. He had spent 30 years telling people at dinner parties that his daughter chased paperwork for a living. He said it like an insult, and it was true. That is exactly what I do. I chase paper. I read stamps and seals and mix designs and load calculations, and I can tell you the year a drawing was made from the way the linework tapers. He'd handed me a collapsed building and asked me to lie about it. He should have asked somebody who couldn't read. I started with the public record, because it's free, and because $312 in cash was every dollar I had access to on this earth. Larkspur Crossing's construction drawings were on file with the city. I pulled them at the permit office the next morning in a paper coat of dust, 41 sheets, and I laid them out on the floor of my office above the tire shop with my knees on sheet S3. The structural sheets bore an embossed seal, Colorado Professional Engineer License Number C147. The name under the seal read R. Hollis, P.E. I sat back on my heels. My father is not an engineer. Roy Hollis has a business degree from a school in Ohio and has never held a license in any state. Everyone at our family knows that. It was a joke at Thanksgiving. Dad can't do fractions. Dad hires the smart ones. R. Hollis, P.E. was Ruth. Ruth Hollis, my grandmother. Born 1945. One of 11 women in her graduating engineering class. She founded the company in 1979 out of the garage of a house on Emerson Street. And she carried license C11407 for as long as I could remember hearing her name. which I had not heard in a very long time. I was 5 the last time I saw her, and my memory of her is one image, worn thin from handling. A woman with a gray braid down her back, kneeling on a driveway, showing me how to see the crack in a slab. She told me cracks aren't damage. Cracks are the building telling you something in the only language it has. When I was 5, she went away. My mother, Adele Hollis, 64, always said it the same way, in the same voice, like a line of scripture. Your grandmother's mind broke. She has to be somewhere safe. It isn't a thing we discuss. 32 years of not discussing it. I pulled the Colorado Licensing Board's public database. C11147 was listed as active. Continuing education credits filed every cycle, right up through last year. An 81-year-old woman whose mind broke in 1994 had been filing continuing education credits. I went to the Secretary of State's office and pulled the 1979 Articles of Incorporation for Hollis Structural. They were typed on an actual typewriter. The company had issued 2 classes of stock. Class non-voting, non-distributed among officers, Class A. Voting 62% of the total, held by the founder. Ruth Hollis owned 62% of Hollis Structural and had owned it for 47 years. Then I did the thing I do best. I pulled every set of sealed drawings Hollis had filed with the city and county of Denver since 1994, and I compared the seals. You have to understand what a seal is. It isn't a signature you dash off. It isn't a signature you dash off. It's a licensed engineer personally reviewed and takes responsibility for the work. On paper, it's an embossed impression, plus an ink signature crossing it. The signature is the part that matters. I scanned high-resolution images of Ruth's genuine signature from the 1979 articles, from a 1986 bridge inspection report, from a 1991 letter to the city. Then I scanned the seal signatures from 1996, 2004, 2011, 2019, and from sheet S3 of Larkspur Crossing, dated 2 years ago. You know what a forger can't fake? Pen lifts. Everybody's hand hesitates in its own particular places, and after 50 years those hesitations are as fixed as a fingerprint. Ruth lifted her pen twice in her surname, once after the H, once before the final S. In every document after 1994, the pen never left the paper. Somebody had spent 3 decades practicing my grandmother's name. I sat on the floor of that office with 41 sheets of a building that killed 2 people, and I understood what I was actually holding. It wasn't a fraud case. Fraud is about money. Every structure Hollis had built for 32 years had been sealed by an engineer who never saw it. Nobody licensed had ever checked the math. Not on the parking garage, not on the elementary school on Sheridan, not on the 11-story senior apartment building on Colfax, where 400 people were sleeping that night. Larkspur Crossing wasn't an accident. Larkspur Crossing was the first one to come due. I threw up in the sink behind the coffee maker. That night was my parents' anniversary gala at the Brown Palace, and I went because I needed one thing and only Roy had it. I still had the dress from Bianca's wedding. I wore my hair down. I walked into a ballroom full of developers and 2 state legislators, and a man from the governor's office, and I found my father by the bar, holding court about a rezoning fight he'd won. I asked him one question. I asked him who signed the Larkspur drawings. The room did not go quiet, but a piece of it did. Roy's face changed by maybe 2 degrees. Then he did what he always does. He got loud, so that everyone would understand this was a performance and not a conversation. He said I was a disappointment who audits parking lots for a living. He said my daughter was sick because life is expensive and I'd chosen to be poor. He said that Bianca's husband understood how the world works and that I never had. My mother stood 10 feet away, holding a champagne flute, and studied the carpet. My sister, Bianca, stood beside her, and I want to be exact about this because it matters later. Bianca looked at me. She didn't look away. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read at the time and can read perfectly now. Roy reached into his coat pocket. He took out a card and dropped it on the marble at my feet. It was an RTD monthly bus pass, $31. unlimited local rides. He told me to take the bus back to the hospital, since I couldn't afford anything else. He told me not to bother hiring an attorney for Thursday, because he'd already retained every firm in this city worth retaining, and the rest weren't worth my time. Then he turned his back on me and told a state senator about a marina project his firm had just sealed in Grand Junction, and how it was going to make him a very rich man twice over. I bent down and picked up the pass. I want to tell you I felt rage. I didn't. I felt the specific, clarifying cold you feel when you finally see the load path. When the diagram in your head snaps into place and you know exactly where the structure is going to fail. He just told me there was another sealed job in Grand Junction. He just told me, in front of witnesses, that he personally controlled what got sealed. I put the bus pass in my coat pocket. I walked out through the lobby and into the cold, and I rode the 15 bus back to my truck, and I did not spend one more thing that night. Here is what my $3 and $12 bought me over the next 3 days: $14 in copies at the county clerk's office, $61 of gas, one motel room in Rawlins, Wyoming, and a lot of black coffee. Because the licensing board's records showed something else once I paid for the certified file. Ruth Hollis's continuing education credits and license renewals had been submitted. Every single cycle. From an address in Ravalli County, Montana. Wintergreen Meadows Residential Care, Hamilton, Montana, 940 miles from Denver. The petition that put her there was a Colorado guardianship, filed in 1994, petitioner Roy Hollis. The court had sealed the medical exhibits, but guardianship accountings are public, and the accountings showed that for 32 years, a blind trust had wired Wintergreen Meadows a monthly payment for the care of one resident, and that the same trust had, every renewal cycle, cut a check to the Colorado Licensing Board for $178. He hadn't just hidden her. He'd kept her license alive so he could keep using her name. I called Danny from a gas station outside Casper. Nell had spiked a fever, and it had broken, and she'd asked where I was. He told her I was working. He told me the financial coordinator had called twice. He asked me if I was sure. I told him that if I signed my father's letter, Nell would get her transplant, and then in 3 or 4 or 9 years, some other kid's father would be standing under a Hollis roof when it came down. I told him I could not build our daughter a life on that. Danny was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Go get your grandmother. I've driven to a lot of ugly places for work. Wintergreen Meadows was not ugly. That's what got me. It was a low cedar building with a good roof and a bird feeder, tucked against the bitterroots, and there were tulips coming up along the walk. You don't need a dungeon. You just need a locked wing and a signature." The receptionist's name was Charlene. She was in her 50s, reading a paperback, and she had the particular exhaustion of someone who has worked in a place a long time and stopped asking questions in order to keep working there. I did not lie to her. I want to be clear about that, because it's the reason it worked. I put my Colorado engineering license on the counter and my business card next to it. I told her I was a forensic engineer investigating a fatal structural collapse. I told her that documents bearing the professional seal of a resident of this facility had been filed with a municipal building department, that 2 people were dead, and that I had reason to believe those documents were forged. Then I told her the part that made her put down the book. I said that if a resident's professional credentials were being used from this address without her knowledge, then Wintergreen Meadows was, at minimum, the mailing address on a felony. I said I could either speak to that resident for 20 minutes, or I could call the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office from the parking lot and let them ask. Charlene looked at me for a long time. Then she said something I did not expect. She said, "Are you Tessa?" I said yes. She said Ruth had told her 20 years ago that if anybody ever came, it would be the granddaughter, and that she should be let in. Charlene walked me back herself. She used a badge on 2 doors and a key on the 3rd, and she told me quietly while we walked that Ruth had not taken the evening medication in 11 years, that she cheeked it and spit it into a tissue, that 3 different aides knew, and none of them had ever written it down. The room was small. There was a window with a view of the mountains, a narrow bed, a chair. And in the chair was an 81-year-old woman with a gray braid down her back and reading glasses on the end of her nose, working the Sunday crossword in ink. She looked up. Her eyes were the clearest thing in that building. She looked at my dusty coat, and my boots, and the roll of drawings under my arm. Then she took off her glasses, folded them, and asked me whether I'd finally come to see the crack in the slab. I couldn't speak. I stood in the doorway of that room with my throat closed like a fist. She told me to sit down and stop wasting daylight. I want you to understand who my grandmother is, because I had been raised on a story about a broken mind and every word of it was a lie. Ruth Hollis had run the numbers on 18 bridges. In 1993, she caught her son's moving company money into a shell entity to cover a development he'd promised investors and couldn't deliver. She told him she was going to report it to the board and dissolve the company. 11 months later, she was in a car with her son and a doctor she'd never met, on her way to an evaluation she'd been told was a routine physical. She never got a hearing she could attend. The guardianship was granted ex parte on emergency grounds. Her Class A shares, 62%, voting, passed under the control of her guardian. Her guardian was Roy. For the first 4 years, she said, they kept her sedated enough that she lost the thread. Then in 1998, a night aide, a woman she never saw again, sat on the edge of her bed and told her that a person who does not swallow cannot be poisoned. And Ruth Hollis, who had been a structural engineer for 31 years, started doing what structural engineers do. She waited, and she watched the load path. She had a notebook, 32 years of them actually, stacked in a plastic bin under her bed, and I have read every page. Dates of every visit Roy ever made. 9, in 3 decades. Names of every attorney who came with him. The exact dates, copied from the newspaper the facility left in the day room, of every Hollis project groundbreaking she read about. Because every one of those projects required her seal, and she knew, sitting in a chair in Montana, that her son was signing her name to buildings she had never seen. She had known for 28 years. She had no phone, no money, no visitors, no way to get one certified letter to one attorney who couldn't be bought by the man holding her guardianship. She told me she'd stopped praying for rescue a long time ago. She said she'd started praying for a weapon instead. Then she looked at my roll of drawings and asked to see sheet S3. She held it up to the window, she traced the seal with one fingernail, and she said, in a voice with no shake in it at all, he didn't lift the pen. I told her about Larkspur, about Ernesto Salas and Priya Raman, about Nell, about Monday and the donor slot and Thursday's letter. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one question. She asked whether I had come to save her, or to win. I said I didn't know that those were different. She said they were, and that I had better decide, because if I walked her out those doors that afternoon, Roy would know inside of 2 hours. He'd liquidate. He'd move offshore what he could and burn what he couldn't. And the licensing board would spend 9 years untangling it. And every building would stay standing with a forged seal on its file, and my daughter would be dead by Christmas. She told me she was going to stay. I said absolutely not. I said I was not leaving her in this room one more night. Ruth stood up, 81 years old, 5'2", and she put both hands on my shoulders like she was checking a column for plum. She said she had not been a victim since 1998. She said she'd been a general with no army, and now she had one, and generals do not surrender the high ground to feel better. Then she told me exactly what to do in order. And she was right about all of it. She had me get Charlene. She had Charlene witness. And on the tray table in that little room, my grandmother executed 3 documents. The first was a sworn affidavit, notarized by a notary Charlene drove into Hamilton to fetch, stating that Ruth Hollis had never reviewed, approved, or sealed any engineering document dated after March 1994. The second was a revocation of every proxy and power of attorney granted to Roy Hollis on the grounds that the 1994 guardianship had been procured by fraud. The third was an irrevocable transfer of her 62% Class A voting interest in Hollis Structural Incorporated. She signed all three, and when she signed, she lifted her pen twice. She looked up at me over her glasses and said, "Now they'll be able to tell." I drove 940 miles back to Denver, and I don't remember most of it. I remember stopping once, at 4 in the morning, at a rest area outside Sheridan, Wyoming, and taking the bus pass out of my coat pocket and looking at it under the dome light. $31. My father's idea of what I was worth thrown on a marble floor. It had ridden with me the whole way. I did not spend it. I put it back in my pocket. I called an attorney I'd testified alongside twice, a woman named Priscilla Nakashima, who takes cases on contingency when she smells blood in the water. And I read her the affidavit over speakerphone while she was still in her bathrobe. She was awake by the second paragraph. She filed the transfer with the state registry Thursday morning at 8:04. And then we did the second half, which was Ruth's idea, and which is the reason I sleep at night. Because there were 400 people in the senior building on Colfax. We compiled everything. The seal comparisons, the 1979 articles, the guardianship accountings showing a trust paying a licensing board for a woman it had declared incompetent. Grant's internal Sentinel emails, which, it turns out, I did not need to hack, because a claims director who retroactively rescinds a policy on his own sister-in-law's dying child does it on a corporate server, using his own login at 9:41 in the morning. We sent it 4 places at once on Thursday at 4 p.m., time to land while everyone was still at their desks. The FBI's Denver field office. The Colorado State Board of Licensure for architects, professional engineers, and professional land surveyors. The Colorado Division of Insurance. And, because Ruth insisted, the City and County of Denver Building Department, with a list of every Hollis project sealed after 1994, and a recommendation for immediate structural reassessment of 11 of them. Then I did the hardest thing in this entire story. I did nothing. I went back to the hospital. I sat with Nell, and we watched a show about a family of otters. Roy's. Grant emailed twice, then 3 times, then sent one that just said, "Answer me." My mother left a voicemail saying she hoped I was proud of myself and that a woman who won't bend for her family will end up alone, and that this was a lesson in humility. I listened to all 41 seconds of it. I didn't feel anything. I set the phone face down on the tray table. In this work, silence is a load test. You let the structure carry itself and you watch where it moves. Roy spent Thursday night and Friday morning absolutely certain he had won, and every arrogant thing he did in those hours was later entered into evidence. Friday, 9 a.m., Courtroom 5B, Denver District Court. Judge Imelda Krantz presiding. I came alone. Priscilla was 2 blocks away with her phone in her hand, which was the arrangement, because Ruth had been very specific that Roy needed to believe, right up until the last second, that I had no one. He did not disappoint. He'd brought 5 attorneys. He'd brought my mother in a cream-colored suit, and Bianca in cashmere, and Grant, who checked his watch when I walked in like I'd kept him from something. Roy stood up. He looked around the gallery, at the 2 reporters he'd probably called himself, and he said it loud enough for the back row. He asked whether his daughter couldn't afford a lawyer. The gallery laughed. Some of them worked for him. I didn't say anything. I had one manila folder in my hands, and I could feel the edges of it, the way you feel the grip of a torque wrench right before it clicks. Judge Krantz gavelled once. She asked Roy's counsel to sit down and asked me if I had anything to submit. I said yes, Your Honor, 3 things. The first was a certified copy of the 1779 Articles of Incorporation of Hollis Structural, establishing that 62% of the voting interest had always been held by the founder, Ruth Hollis, and that Roy Hollis had never held title to it, only a guardian's control. The second was a federally registered, notarized transfer of that 62% executed 48 hours earlier by Ruth Hollis, of sound mind, in the presence of two witnesses, at Wintergreen Meadows Residential Care in Hamilton, Montana. The third was a single sheet of paper. It was a side-by-side, Ruth's genuine seal signature from 1991, and the seal signature on sheet S3 of Larkspur Crossing, dated 2 years ago, enlarged, with the pen lifts circled in red. I set it on the bench. Roy's lead attorney came around the table to look at it. He picked it up. He read it. And then this man, who had been paid a great deal of money to be unshakable, said out loud, to nobody, "That's not her snitchich. That seal isn't hers." The room heard him say it. Roy's knees went. He grabbed the table edge with both hands. And he said her name, low, like a man identifying a sound in a house he thought was empty. Ruth. Judge Krantz asked Roy's counsel whether he was aware that the plaintiff acquiesced, standing to bring it, as the plaintiff did not hold a controlling interest in the entity on whose behalf he had petitioned. Grant was already standing. He'd figured it out before Roy had. Risk managers always do. He turned toward the aisle. The doors at the back of courtroom 5B opened. They didn't kick them in. That's a movie thing. 4 federal agents came in quietly, in windbreakers, and a fifth spoke very briefly to the bailiff. Judge Krantz stopped the proceeding. They took Grant in the aisle. They took Roy at the table, and he was still holding on to it, and they had to say his name 3 times. My mother did not stand up. My mother sat in the front row in her cream-colored suit and did not stand up, and that is the last image I have of her that I trust. Bianca stood up. She walked past our father, who was being read his rights, and she walked past Grant, who was saying her name, and she came to me at the plaintiff's table, and she was shaking so hard she could barely open her mouth. She said, "I signed something." In 2016, she'd witnessed a document. She was 24. Roy had put a pen in her hand at a Christmas party and said, "Sign here." "Sweetheart, it's for the accountants." She'd known for 10 years that whatever it wasn't for the accountants. She'd never asked. She had a house and a car and a husband, and she had built a whole life out of not asking. I had her signature. It was in the packet I'd sent the FBI. It was enough to make her a subject of the investigation, and if I'd said nothing, she'd have gone down with them. I stood there in that courtroom, holding everything I'd ever wanted, which was the power to hurt every single person who had ever hurt me. And I thought about Ruth in that chair, with her crossword in ink, saying, "You had better decide." Bianca was 24. I was 27 when I stopped answering my father's calls, and the only difference between us is that I had somewhere to go and she didn't. I told her to call Priscilla Nakashima. I told her to walk into the U.S. Attorney's office before they came to her, and to tell them everything, and not to let Grant's lawyer anywhere near her. She did. She testified for 2 days. It cost her the house, the car, and the husband, and she says it's the first thing she's ever owned outright. Sentinel Mutual reinstated our policy at 11:20 that morning because a general counsel who has just watched the FBI arrest his senior claims director moves with tremendous speed. Nell's conditioning chemo started Monday. Her donor, a man named Curtis, a 34-year-old HVAC installer from Ohio, who swabbed his cheek at a college blood drive in 2011 and forgot about it for 15 years, flew to Denver on a Tuesday, sat in a chair for 4 hours, and gave my daughter the marrow that is currently making every drop of blood in her body. Nell's platelets crossed engraftment on day 19. She is 8 now. She has a scar on her chest from the central line, and she thinks it's the most interesting thing about her. And Bartholomew the elk sat on the pillow for every single day of it. Roy Hollis pleaded not guilty to 18 counts and lost on all but 3. The federal case was wire fraud and conspiracy. The state added forgery of a professional seal, criminal impersonation, and the one that put the number where it belongs, felony at-risk elder abuse and guardianship fraud. The 2 counts of criminally negligent homicide for Ernesto Salas and for Priya Raman ran consecutive 24 years. He is 67. Rowan County, Colorado does not have a country club unit. Grant Wexler took a plea and got 17 years for insurance fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. He tried to trade information for a reduction. He didn't have anything Ruth's notebooks hadn't already given us. The Larkspur Crossing family settled. Every dollar of it came out of Hollis Structural, and I signed the checks, and I flew to Pueblo and sat in Ernesto Salas's kitchen with his widow while she cried, and I did not once say the words, "It wasn't my fault." 11 Hollis buildings were reassessed. 9 were fine. Ruth's original standards were so far above code that even a fraud built on them held up. 2 were not. The senior apartment building on Colfax needed $400,000 of sheer reinforcement, and 400 people slept through the work, and nobody died, and I will take that trade every day for the rest of my life. The Monday after the sentencing, I drove to Montana with 2 nurses, a federal marshal, and a court order, and we walked my grandmother out the front door of Wintergreen Meadows. She stopped on the walk by the tulips and stood there with her face turned up for about a minute. Charlene cried. Ruth patted her hand and told her to go find a better job, and gave her the name of some to call, and Charlene runs the office at a memory care center in Missoula now that actually deserves the name. Here is the part I need to say out loud, because I know what you're thinking. I did not keep it. The 62% was never mine. Ruth signed it to me as a weapon on a tray table, because a weapon needs a hand to hold it, and hers was locked in a building in Montana. 6 weeks later, in Priscilla's conference room, I signed all of it back. Ruth Hollis is 82 years old, and she is the chairman and majority shareholder of Hollis Structural. And she goes into the office on Emerson Street on Tuesdays and Thursdays and terrifies everyone. She kept 12% for herself. She put 20 into a trust for the Salas and Rahman families. She gave the rest to the employees in an ESOP because she said a company that murders people needs owners who have to look at each other in the parking lot. She left me nothing, and she asked me first whether that was all right, and I told her that if she'd left me a dime, I would have thrown it in the South Platte. I still work above the tire shop. I still drive the Tacoma. It has 240,000 miles on it. Skising. There's one more thing. In the courtroom, after they took Roy out and before the gallery emptied, I walked over to the plaintiff's table where he'd been sitting. His reading glasses were still there. His legal pad with the top page torn off. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the RTD monthly bus pass. $31, unlimited local rides, expired the previous Sunday. I had never spent it, not one ride after that first one, the night he threw it at my feet and told me it was all I'd ever be able to afford. I set it down on the table where his hands had been. Because he was right about one thing, he gave me exactly what I needed to get to where I was going. He just didn't ask where I was going. I've thought a lot about why it worked, and it isn't because I'm clever. There are 10,000 forensic engineers in this country, and any one of them could have read that seal. It worked because of a thing my father believed so deeply he never once examined it, that a person who has nothing has no leverage. He'd spent 30 years measuring me against a balance sheet. He froze my accounts because he thought money was the load-bearing element of my life. And when the accounts froze and the ceiling didn't come down, it never occurred to him to ask what was actually holding me up. He couldn't see it. It wasn't on any statement he knew how to read. That's the thing about people like him. They build their whole kingdom on the assumption that everyone's standing on something, because they are. And so they never learn to recognize the ones who are standing on something else. Ruth waited 28 years in a chair by a window, and she wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for a load path. She spent 3 decades keeping her mind sharp on crossword puzzles in ink and newspaper articles about her own stolen buildings, so that on the day somebody finally walked through that door, she would be a general and not a casualty. I don't tell this story so you'll admire us. Neither of us did anything heroic. I read paperwork. She refused to swallow a pill. But if you're sitting there tonight and somebody has you cornered, if they've taken your money, or your name, or the thing you love most, and they're smiling at you because they're sure you have nothing left. I want you to hear me. Go find out what you actually know how to do. Not what you own, what you know, what your hands do without being told, the thing you've done 10,000 times, the skill so ordinary to you that you've stopped noticing you have it. That's the thing they never counted. That's the thing that isn't on the balance sheet. They will hand you the shovel and tell you to dig your own grave, and they will stand there and watch, because they cannot imagine you using it for anything else. Let them watch.